Amendment number 91, printed in House Report 114-683. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alaska seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 91, printed in House Report number 114-683, offered by Mr. Young of Alaska.
Pursuant to House Resolution 820, the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alaska.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to revive and extend.
So ordered.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment prohibits the funds in this act from being used to issue the final rule of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, which would seize authority away from the Alaskan Fish and Game of the state of Alaska to manage fish and wildlife on both non-subsistence and subsistence uses on federal refuge lands in Alaska. In addition, this amendment prohibits funds to be used on the existing National Park Service rule that interferes with the State Wildlife Management Authority on the national preserves, which are guaranteed hunting under the Alaska National Lands Act in Alaska. The two rules in question violate the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, ANILCA, passed by Congress and signed into law in 1980. It protects the ability of the state of Alaska to manage wildlife across the state on state, private, and federal lands. This chamber voted in favor of a similar amendment in this language in the Sportsman's Package H.R. 2604 back in February. These regulations are nothing more than the illegal overreach of the federal government on a state of Alaska that agreed in the Constitution is in the law that they manage all fish and game on all lands of the state of Alaska, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition to this amendment. I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from California, Mr. Cardenas.
The gentleman from California is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to speak. I stand to strongly oppose this amendment. This amendment would block federal rules aimed at protecting wolves, wolverines, black bears, grizzly bears, and lynx from some of the most egregious hunting and killing methods. These methods include shooting defenseless swimming caribou from a motorboat, using airplanes to scout and shoot grizzly bears, luring grizzlies with rotting meat and pet food to get point-blank kills, killing wolf, black bear, and coyote mothers, their dependent pups and cubs at their dens, and trapping of grizzly and black bears with steel-jawed leg-hold traps and wire snares. These methods are inhumane and contrary to our values here in this great country. We should support the scientists, rangers, and wildlife managers in the Fish and Wildlife Service and National Park Service in their efforts to maintain healthy ecosystems. I urge my colleagues to vote no and strike this poison pill rider from this bill. These are egregious things that we should not tolerate, and we should not codify them in law. Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Minnesota reserves. The gentleman from Alaska is recognized.
I am deeply disappointed in the comments just made because all he said is not true. The state does not den, state does not snare, state does not trap, state does not kill wantonly. The state manages. And to have the federal government manage the game when it is the law, the Constitution, the state of Alaska, an agreement made with this body, now to have an agency to take that over, and the propaganda that's espoused on this floor from the Humane Society is inappropriate of this body. It's a flat-out lie. That's what it is. That is not true. The state manages, and they have not used these practices, but they have a right and should have a right to manage the fishing game on the property which was guaranteed to us. And I understand where this pressure is coming from. We in Alaska face this every day. No one understands that we have people in Alaska, we have natives in Alaska that actually want the state to manage their fishing game or would like to manage it by themselves, which I do support. But to have the federal government come in is wrong. It's against our Constitution, and I will stand by this bill, this amendment, to stop monies to be spent by an agency that's overreaching in reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
At this time, Mr. Chair, I'd like to reserve 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment. I respect the concern of the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young, and his advocacy for his state, but I oppose this proposal, which in this case does not present an opportunity for a balanced approach to wildlife management. Let me clarify why the National Wildlife Refuge is proposing these rules. According to the United States Fish and Wildlife Services, certain types of inhumane hunting, such as bear baiting and den hunting, has affected federal refuge areas for wildlife. In fact, one refuge in the Kenai Peninsula had an emergency closing due to extreme decrease in numbers of brown bears caused by these hunting practices. Rather than shutting down areas where these hunting methods are causing the overkilling of native Alaskan predators and restricting access to all hunters, it seems reasonable to me to provide a balanced approach, which provides for a means of traditional permit-based hunting. Nothing in the rule of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, nothing in the rule would limit traditional hunting practices or tactics, but rather it continues and protects existing hunting practices. Unfortunately, this amendment does not address the wildlife diversity and mechanisms in place to maintain it. Therefore, it impacts the National Wildlife Refuge's ability to maintain its parks in a responsible manner and provide native animals with a refuge. We as members of Congress have a federal responsibility to ensure that our national wildlife refuges are being used in the most responsible manner possible. The very agency Congress has vested with the responsibility to manage our wildlife thinks these killing tactics pose a threat to the necessary diversity of the wildlife, and I agree with them. I urge my colleagues to support the ability of the Fish and Wildlife Service to effectively manage our national wildlife refuges for future generations of Americans. I urge a no vote on the amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Minnesota reserves. The gentleman from Alaska is recognized.
Well, I appreciate the comments from the gentleman. I will say, though, all these instances that are being referred to have not happened under state management. And I will suggest respectfully that Fish and Wildlife is no longer a manager of Fish and Wildlife. They have become people that prohibit activity on the refuges. That was not why these refuges were made. They were made by the people that hunt and fish. And now we're having other groups that say this is inhumane. It has nothing to do with it. I'm a little bit shocked that, that we're reading the things from the Humane Society and PETA and all these other groups. That is not the true facts. I've asked you to please look at the true facts. The management is crucial to the state of Alaska. And as I mentioned before, we ought to really think about maybe management by the native corporations on their lands too. But to have the federal government manage, which has done a miserable job of management of game. Their idea of management is just to leave them walk around, well, let nature take care of it. I happen to know a little about nature. It doesn't take care of it. We're just talking about management. And the state has that right under the Constitution. So I urge a yes vote on my amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment circumvents the established rulemaking process, which solicits public input and uses best available science to reach a decision. Alaska's aggressive predatory control practices and disregard for science-based management and the approach of the service would negatively impact the stability of the ecosystems and wildlife throughout the region. And as 31 biologists and scientists stated in March 28, 2016, with a letter to the Interior Secretary Jewell and Service Director Ash, and I quote, "The most current and best available science is clear that predator control measures intended to restore the herds, such as moose and caribou, are doomed to failure because the herds need to access nutrition, their main limiting factor. Alaska's intensive management scheme is the wrong approach and to conserving natural systems." So with that, I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of her time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alaska. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 92, printed in House Report 114-683. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alaska seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 92, printed in House Report number 114-683, offered by Mr. Young of Alaska.
Pursuant to House Resolution 820, the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alaska.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to revive and extend.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment is very simple. It prevents funding from this act to be used to remove 3 Arctic sales that already have taken place 2017 and 2022 Outer Continental Shelf Gas and Leasing proposed program. The economic benefits would be associated with offshore development in the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas that are tremendous. In those 2 areas alone, we have the potential to produce about 23.6 billion barrels of oil and 104 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, potentially creating 54,700 jobs, and nationwide will generate billions of dollars in revenue for the state and local governments. May I suggest respectfully this money can be used in conservation efforts, land and water conservation funds. You can't have that program without development of oil, yet everybody I know on that side supports the program. The second thing is, if I can say one thing, we sit with our heads in the sand when across the border, China, the other nations are developing. We must, in fact, be part players of this program. To do it wisely, do it safely, and do it for the benefit of the American people. Now, if you don't believe in fossil fuels, I understand that. But there's no way that we're not going to be using fossil fuels for many years to come. If we are to do so, let's use that which is safe. And we've already proven it can be done safely in the Arctic. It's not the frontier that people think it is. It's 150 feet deep. If we don't do this, off our shores, it'll be done by foreign countries. So I'm asking the Department of the Interior not to withdraw those sales. It means money to the Treasury. It means we have a less of a dependence on foreign oil, and it means we'll be actively involved. When the other countries are involved, we'll be there with our equipment. We'll be able to have an oil spill recovery if they spill the oil, because they will not. I know the parties play in this. We will. So I urge the adoption of my amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment would mandate that the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management include specific areas in the Alaska region of the Outer Continental Shelf in its 2017-2022 lease sales schedule. This amendment would undermine the Bureau's fundamental mission to manage the development of offshore resources in an environmentally and economically responsible manner. In 2017-2022 Outer Continental Shelf Oil and Gas Lease Program was proposed in March of this year, and the public comment has only closed a few weeks ago. The Bureau is required by law to consider the environmental impacts of a leasing decision, and this includes a comprehensive program environmental impact statement, and it is inappropriate to circumvent this process. Lease sales should be informed by sound science using the best data available. This amendment would violate multiple environmental statutes, including NEPA, the Maritime Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, and the Coastal Zone Management Act. The amendment undermines the environmental protection required by law, and therefore I must oppose the amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from Alaska is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, these leases were put up for lease in 2017 and 2022. We're not asking for any additional new leases. We're asking for the leases to remain in the sales. And then we address the environmental issue as the sales take place before we have development. I'm suggesting respectfully, if we don't have those areas open, these 3 Arctic sale areas, then leases will not be issued in any other area. Oil is not where you want it to be, it's where it is. And so I'm saying we can address all the issues the good lady's concerned with after the sales take place. We receive the money, and if it can't be done safely, it can be stopped at that time. This happened with Shell. So I'm just saying that this is an idea not to let an agency or administration to get ahead of itself and say, oh, we're going to take those leases back. That's the prerogative of the agency, yes, but the leases were put up to begin with. So we ought to take and accept that. Let's go through the process, and the process will follow through, and then we'll decide the environmental impact, the culture, and then we'll have the way to do it right and correctly. And with that, I'll reserve just to see how many more speakers you have.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Mr. Chair, my colleague from Alaska, I don't have any other speakers. It's just me. And thank you so much.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Obviously, we disagree once again. My concern as this amendment would mandate the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management to include specific areas in the 2017-22 lease sale schedule, and that the Bureau needs to uphold the law. It is required to follow the law to consider environmental impacts of leasing decisions. And with that, this amendment would also violate, as I pointed out, quite a few statutes: NEPA, Maritime Mammal Protection, Endangered Species Act, Coastal Zone Management Act, and so therefore I must oppose the amendment. With that, I yield back.
The gentle lady yields back the balance of her time. The questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alaska. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I request a roll call. Thank you.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alaska will be postponed. Number 93, printed in House Report 114-683. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alaska seek recognition?
I have an amendment desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Number 93, printed in House Report Number 114-683, offered by Mr. Young of Alaska.
Pursuant to House Resolution 820, the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alaska.
Mr. Chairman, this is an amendment. It's very simple. This is an area called the 40 miles, a mining area in the state of Alaska. This has been mined since 1895, and for some reason, for 170 acres, there was an attempt by the BLM to go in and stop this mining. These are not large mines. These are mom-and-pop operations, placer operations, and they put down ridiculous regulation and reclamation now, and want them to reclaim the land back to the original state before it was ever mined, not with the disturbance of the mining they were doing. It's amazing to me that they'd even think about doing this. And I'm talking about people who have been there for 20 years, most of them retired. They're really, if I had to say anything, that they're the mom and pop of Alaska. They're the spirit of Alaska. And all of a sudden we have the big agency coming in and saying, you have to have a reclamation area that this is the way that we want it done. And yet they don't recognize what's been done in the past and how it's worked. And what they're proposing is wrong, and it costs a considerable amount of money to these small mom and pop miners. One of our big plaques in the state of Alaska is the gold pan. And yet we have this agency come in for 140 acres. That's all they're talking about. For some reason, they got an idea that we want to put them out of business. And I'm just saying, no, they have not to impose these regulations. Follow the state mining law, and the reclamation that takes place now works. Let them continue to do that, and we can reclaim the land. And they're agreeable to that. They just can't do what they're asking them to do because they can't afford to do it. It's that simple. This is a simple amendment trying to protect mom-and-pop operations in the state of Alaska like you would do in your state for any other operation where the federal government is coming in and try to take it away. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge the yes on this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I raise an opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
Most of the 186 active mining operations on BLM, these are federal managed lands in Alaska, are placer mining operations. Between 400 and 800 miles of BLM federal managed streams have historic or active placer mining impacts, and there is a legacy of historic claim with reduced ecosystem function. Now, BLM continues various outreach activities, including public meetings and interactions with individual miners, and is working with industry to incorporate best practice management and to use new science-based reclamation techniques to accelerate stream recovery. I hear what the gentleman is saying about state lands and state recovery, and what the state of Alaska chooses to do with recovery in its own boundaries, state boundaries, is one thing, but these are federal lands. And in the course of reclamated activities, it may be necessary to increase an annual cost to miners to recover these streams and restore the ecosystem function. The amendment prohibits assessing the cost of reclaiming these areas to placer miners who are profiting from federal mineral extraction on federally managed land, BLM land. So the taxpayer all across this country should not be shouldering the burden of these restoration costs. The responsible party should. And so that is why I strongly oppose this amendment. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from Alaska is recognized.
My good lady friend, I'd suggest one thing. We're only talking about 49 families. This is smaller. I'm not talking about all the other placer mining. This is, in fact, the 40-mile miners. And, I mean, they've been there forever. Like I say, you can go there, and it's like looking into a museum, 1895. And they're patented claims. It's their land. A lot of it's state land. And they're claiming it because it is placer mining. The BLM's claiming they have the authority to impose a reclamation system that does not work. Did they consult? No. I'm just saying, keep in mind, we're not talking about corporations. We're not talking about large industry. We're talking about, very frankly, you go up there, and I wish you would, you'll find out they're a pretty good group of older Alaskans, some hippies. We still have a few of those left. And they're not making any money. This is an occupation. But if they have to do what the BLM is suggesting they do, and by the way, there's fish in that stream now, and it was mined in 1895, what they're asking, it will break. They can't do it. And you say, good. Well, that's taking people. This is a huge area. It's not big area. I mean, the total area. And that I'm not arguing. I'm just talking about this little 40-mile group. And so, you know, give them a break. Let them go out and make enough money to buy Saturday night party time. And I urge the passage of my amendment. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Well, the gentleman from Alaska has convinced me of one thing. I need to go back to Alaska, and I need to spend some time with you there. But I still oppose this amendment. The American taxpayer should not be, accepting the burden of restoration costs to make sure that these waterways are reclaimed to how they should be. And with that, I'm going to continue to oppose this amendment. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of her time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alaska. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Resolution 820, I offer amendments in block.
The clerk will designate the amendments en bloc.